Should I still record it on here?
Yeah, still recorded on here.
All right. Okay, yeah, I have it. Oh, it says Washington University in St. Louis.
That's all good. Just tells our location.
Huh?
So that should be fine, right? It's worked every other time. So
No, I'm saying on the actual video feed, it says Washington University in St. Louis, powered by Zoom.
oh, that's fine.
Well, okay, you probably don't want that in the actual video.
No, yeah, I'll take it. I'll try to take it out, but it's not a big deal.
Okay.
For now,
you're gonna have to cut out this first part at least.
Yeah, I will. I will.
Okay. Well, yeah, just start off with let's go Nets Celtics first, right?
Why don't we just go in order of the outline?
What you want to talk about? Okay, fine.
Just be easier.
Sounds good.
All right. Welcome, everyone, to a special episode of the Clear Path podcast known as the Play-Off Preview. In this episode, every time a play-in series or round ends, we'll dive deep into who's moving on to the next round and which of your favorite teams you can expect to see. Well, Jeff, it's happy to see you again after our episode yesterday. The play-in games just ended. How are you feeling?
Feeling, there were some great playing games. Last night's were both pretty close, and I think, I'm not sure how competitive both of those 8 seeds are going to be in the first round, but I think the play-in has looked like a really good decision from the NBA, especially because they've given us 2 or even a few pretty close games this weekend.
Yeah, I think it was a great thing. And finally, the matchups are decided. I'm kind of sad that they don't give a little bit more time for those players to rest, but they're really going to go right into the ringer, so to say. So, Jeff, I have my bracket made right here. I don't know if you can see it, but I'm ready to kind of predict the first round. So let's start off with the East. Who do you think is going to win between the Miami Heat and the Hawks? And kind of explain your reasoning as well for me.
Yeah, so, the Heat have obviously had a pretty strong season. I think, they only have 53 wins and they're the 1 seed, which is pretty low, I think, by historical standards. But the East has been really competitive this year.
For sure.
And I think that, the Hawks definitely came into the season with a lot higher expectations after coming off an Eastern Conference Finals appearance. And I think this year, the Hawks defense really looked a lot worse than last year, especially in the first half of the season. And I think especially now with Clint Capella going down for who knows how long, the Hawks are going to have a tough time executing on some of their bread and butter Trey to Capella pick and rolls and lobs.
Yeah.
And, I do think that Miami has some weaknesses on defense in terms of Tyler Hero and Duncan Robinson defending against the isolation. They're 2 of the worst defenders in the league this season in isolation matchups. And I think Trey is definitely going to matchup hunt on both of them when they're on the floor. But I do think that the Miami Heat defense, anchored by Bam Adebayo, has been great this year. They've ended the season on a win streak, which is good after that whole kerfuffle with Spoelstra and Butler. So I think I'm expecting the Heat to ride that momentum and just have a lot more solid unit to take this series. What about you?
Yeah, so just kind of diving deeper into what you were saying, Tyler Hero and Duncan Robinson is usually within the enemy, so to say, or the Hawks, in this case, game plan. And I think they're going to be targeting them in isolation a lot. And I think one thing that really illuminates the Miami Heat's problem is a problem that a lot of middling teams have had in the past, where they have players that are good on offense and they have players that are good on defense, but they are not the same player. That's why we have superstars in this league and we have stars. Tyler Hero and Duncan Robinson are elite offensive players and are essential to the Miami Heat actually generating an offense that can score over 100 points per game. Whereas without them on the floor, they get much better defensively, but their offense actually tanks. Tyler Hero and Jimmy Butler together, actually, when you look at their plus minus numbers, actually have a significantly lower plus minus together than with Jimmy Butler and Bam Adebayo or someone else, which shows that Tyler Hero is best placed in this lineup as a sixth man. But I think for them to win the championship and win this round as a whole, we're going to have to see that start to mature and Tyler Hero and Jimmy Butler start to work together to actually kind of establish a lineup where they're good on offense and good on defense. And I think it's important to also address that Tyler Hero and Duncan Robinson are bad on defense, but they're not the worst defenders in the league. The only reason it seems that way is just because of the fact that they have so many more possessions where they're the primary ball defender. Because everyone knows, would you rather go against Jimmy Butler or Tyler Hero? I would much rather go against Tyler Hero and Duncan Robinson than Jimmy Butler, PJ Tucker, and some of those scrappy defenders that they have on the Miami Heat. Yeah. But as for the Hawks from my side, I think the Hawks have kind of done a lot of what they've done last year, except the East was just much harder to actually get themselves into the playoffs without being in the play-in. Their defense has improved a lot. Their defense used to be in the bottom 10 in the league. Now it's going up into the top 10 in the league. And the line right now for the Atlanta Hawks versus Miami Heat is Miami favored by about 6.5 points in the first game. And I believe the series is predicted to end in about 5 or 6 games. I think it's fair to say to me that this might actually be a harder series than Miami thought, just because of how the Hawks can create offense. I think there's going to be at least one game where the Hawks shoot the lights out of the game and the Miami Heat just can't defend the 3-point shot to that ability. And I think they'll win at least one game, maybe 2. But I don't really think many more games, just because I think Jimmy Butler will show that he's clutch. It's been a long time since we've really seen him clutch in the playoffs. And I think the last time we would have seen that would be whenever the Lakers face the Heat in the bubble. And I think this is just another opportunity. So if I had to give a score, obviously I want a longer series. So I'm going to pick Miami from 4-2. And I think that's probably your best bet in this series, just because I think the Hawks can have a game where Duncan Robinson isn't shooting so well, as he hasn't really been all year, and Trae Young is shooting the lights out of the ball.
Yeah, I think it's definitely worth considering that in a series where one team has the best player, and in this case, Atlanta's Trae Young is likely the best player in the series, you always have to give some sort of chance to that team to win at least a few games. And I think, given that the Heat are the 1 seed, it's extremely unlikely that they're going to lose to Atlanta. But I would give Atlanta a puncher's chance at winning 2 games. I do think that their offensive style, combined with just the ability of Trae to explode off mismatches, and even against pretty solid defense, should give the Hawks a chance in a few games. However, I do think that Miami's offensive scheme, and I think their really solid defense, is going to probably be too much for the Atlanta Hawks, especially with Clint Capella out. That lack of rim protection, and to give Atlanta credit, they did play pretty well last night in the second half, even with Clint Capella out. Okongwu and others really stepped up and made it really difficult for Garland to score. And I expect them to be able to perform and do that a little in this series, but I definitely don't think they're going to be able to win it out, just because I don't think that the Hawks have shown this season that they can produce in a lot of those tight situations. And that, in combination with the fact that the Hawks have one of the worst road records in the league.
Yeah.
I think it's like a bottom 5 road record. They have a great home record this year, but one of the worst road records. They lost Clint Capella. Even though they've improved on defense in the second half of the season, they're not amazing.
Yeah.
And I think the Heat should take this in 6 games.
Sounds good. So this series might not be the most interesting, but this next one arguably has the most pressure on it. And that's the one we'll get into right now. The Philadelphia 76ers versus Toronto Raptors. The Sixers are favored in this first game by about 4.5. I believe most people have this series going about 6 or 7 games. Jeff, I want to know your thoughts on this series.
Yeah, I think so. I generally don't spend too much time thinking about all the things about media pressure and like is Harden nervous? Is MB, but I do think it's worth considering in this series, mainly because Harden's playoff record is not incredible. I think people tend
Yeah.
to dog on Harden a lot for some pretty dismal playoff performances against the Warriors, against
Yeah.
a lot
Against the
of teams
Spurs.
during his run as the Rockets guard. And I
Uh-huh.
think that's worth looking into. But I think the bigger question here is actually about the Raptors defense. I
Yeah.
think that so the Raptors have had the number 2 defense in the league in the last 15 games. And I think their combination of long defenders that put in a lot of effort and are willing to go the extra mile to defend James Harden might really push a lot of these games into the hands of Joel Embiid. And that's definitely not a bad thing. Joel Embiid is an MVP candidate this year. He's an unstoppable scorer, but there are a lot of questions about Embiid's scoring in the last few minutes of the game. Um, some of his scoring package when it comes to crunch time doesn't always convert to amazing clutch performances. We've seen in years past um, centers or forwards, centers like Al Horford have given Joel Embiid a lot of trouble, especially when he tries to play face up against them. So I think something worth examining is how the Raptors defense is going to give problems on the perimeter to Tyrese Maxey, to James Harden, and if Jokic can really convert in these late game situations, because I really do think that a lot of these games are going to come down to the wire. Um, and then, as a third thing to note, Matisse Thybulle is not going to be playing. I'm not going to get political, but you can think what you want about the reason why he's not playing, not having the second dose. But the fact that he's not playing also weakens Philly's defense as well. And I think lacking that length, um, lacking the ability that Matisse Thybulle has to get blocks, to close passing lanes, um, to really make it hard for drivers to the rim is definitely going to give Philly a lot of problems this series.
Yeah, so I think this is one of the most interesting series of the playoffs. Honestly, this series, and then there's one in the West, as well as another one in the East, I think that are the 3 most interesting series. So I really kind of did a deep dive into kind of these 3 series in specific. So starting off with this one, I think, and for the purposes of FanDuel and sports betting, I think you ought to be betting the Toronto Raptors on game 1 and game 2. I believe the Sixers will be favored by about 5 points in each game. And I think betting on one of those games, I don't think the Toronto Raptors will get both home games at the Sixers, but I think there's a very strong possibility they get one. And that kind of changes the complexion of the series as well. But one thing I definitely wanted to address with how the Sixers and Toronto Raptors are going to play. A common saying in boxing goes, styles make fights. And I think these 2 styles are very interesting. So the 76ers play with a superstar style. And that means James Harden and Joel Embiid are going to have the ball in their hands. And nobody else really is going to have the ball in their hands. And this lends to a different kind of offense than the one the Toronto Raptors run, which is where everyone kind of gets their touches and they feed it to the hot man. You saw Precious Achua in their last game versus the Sixers shoot 4 threes. He's a center. He doesn't usually shoot threes, but he was hot that night, so they fed him the ball. Pascal Siakam was hot that night. They fed him the ball. Scotty Barnes was hot. They fed him the ball. Everyone kind of gets touches, and it's a more cohesive offense, I think, than the 76ers. Now, what is the key that I think you should watch for in this game? That is how Joel Embiid plays. I think what the Toronto Raptors are likely to do in this series is double Joel Embiid and force him to become a passer. Sure, sometimes he'll try to get a foul off of the double team, and sure, he's going to go to the free throw line sometimes. But as we all know in the playoffs, the whistle gets a little muffled. Referees are less likely to blow their whistle and call those controversial fouls on players like Joel Embiid. And instead, they're going to let them play. And I think that only serves to benefit the Toronto Raptors, because when Joel Embiid is doubled, he's going to have to pass out of it. But what Joel Embiid does not do that Jokic does do, he is not a great passer. In his whole career, Joel Embiid only has 4 games of over 10 assists. You'd think there's been a lot of games in the playoffs where he's been doubled in the past, but he hasn't even reached that 10 assist mark. Even knowing he has had shooters like JJ Redick, like George Niang on his team right now, he still hasn't been able to assist the basketball at an elite level. That's Harden's job. And then that brings us to James Harden. Can James Harden beat one-on-one perimeter defense? Last time we saw them play in their last matchup, Precious Achiuwa was able to be step for step with him most of the time. Sure, he got some foul calls sometimes, but he was able to keep him under 20 points. I think James Harden needs to go over 20 points, establish himself as a primary rim threat, driving to the basket, and still have that step. If he doesn't have that step, that means it's all going to go to Joel Embiid. And I think then the Toronto Raptors strategy will be to trap him and then force him to push the ball outside to a 3-point shooter. And he's not elite at passing. So I think that's probably forcing them to use their weak hand. And the Toronto Raptors, I think, can really play a lot of different ways on offense. They can shoot the 3 with Freddie. They can play the mid-range with OG Anunoby, with Scotty Barnes, and with Pascal Siakam. So they have a lot of options. And the second point really is for them is that the Toronto Raptors are long and can switch everything. Almost every single one of their players, except Freddie, is about 6'5" to 6'7", meaning that they can switch all around for James Harden, which means that they're not going to be matchup hunting on the Sixers. So I think all of this is advantage to the Toronto Raptors. Obviously, the superstars of the Philadelphia 76ers may give a lot of people pause in picking the Toronto Raptors, but I think here Nick Nurse has shown that he's able to shut down a superstar and he's able to let them score, but make sure that doesn't lead to a win. So I'm definitely going to be picking the Toronto Raptors. I think this will actually only go 6 games. I think they'll win in Toronto 4-2 in favor of the Toronto Raptors. Who are you picking, Jeff?
Yeah, so I think you mentioned something interesting with the Raptors defense.
Yeah.
The Raptors are definitely going to look to hunt for those switches onto players like Maxey and Harden.
Yeah, for sure.
And I think the ability to exploit those weak points in the Philly defense, along with the fact that the Raptors have such long, tall defenders. You talked about Achua, Siakam, Anunoby. All of these guys that are going to create a lot of problems for the Sixers' secondary scoring options, which are Maxey and Harden, are going to make for a very difficult series, in my opinion, for the Sixers to easily score. And I think what that means is that it's going to come down to Joel Embiid. And while I do think that Joel Embiid has had a phenomenal season, and while I think that, if he was your MVP, no one would be mad at you, I think the Sixers have not shown in their 4 matchups against the Raptors this season. They're 1-3, I believe, against the Raptors.
Yeah,
I don't think the Sixers have shown in those games and in the last 15 games of the season that they're going to be able to execute at an extremely high level and defeat the Raptors machine. I would choose Raptors in 6, but I do give credit to Joel Embiid. I give credit to James Harden for being able to figure it out in a few games. So I think this series is going to come down to the wire. And I think the Raptors are probably going to take it in 7 in Philadelphia and send James Harden home and maybe even end Doc Rivers' tenure there.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of noise after the playoffs if the 76ers lose this game for sure for Doc Rivers. Two kind of disappointing seasons in a row. All right, so let's move on to the next series, which is the Milwaukee Bucks versus the Chicago Bulls. This is probably the worst series to talk about, in all honesty, just because of how one-sided it probably is. So the Bucks are favored by 10 points in the first game. I think they might be double-digit favorites throughout the series if they win the first 2 games at least. I think there's a lot of statistics pointing towards the Bucks winning this series. But what do you think? Who do you think is going to win, and what do you think is going to happen?
Yeah, so I think Bulls fans have definitely had a season where they've achieved beyond what they probably expected at the start of the year. I don't think many Bulls fans would have expected to have, for a good part of the season, a top 4 team in the East. But I think we've seen the Bulls really start to be exposed in terms of their defensive weaknesses. And we've also seen teams really adjust to the DeRozan surge and limit the Bulls' offense. Um, just to give some insight, the Bulls have the 26th worst offense, or the 26th best offense in the NBA and 28th best defense in the last 15 games. And I believe their net rating in the last 15 games is also 28th. So the Bulls have really struggled near the end of the season. The Bulls have not, I believe, won any games against top three seeds in either conference, which includes the Bucks. And I think, there's a lot of ways to diagnose what has happened to the Bulls defense. They obviously lost Lonzo Ball, which was an important piece of their defense, along with not having Alex Caruso for part of the year. And I think we've seen the Bulls be pretty weak, especially against a lot of high screens. And I think what happens, especially against a team like Milwaukee, with probably the most potent offensive firepower in the entire NBA, Giannis Antetokounmpo, I think the Bucks are going to be able to create a very, very difficult situation when a lot of your defense against Giannis is coming from like Nikola Vucevic. And I think these matchups, along with the Bulls, just flat out struggles in the last 15 games, are going to make for a very easy first round series for the Bucks.
Yeah, I definitely second that. I think one thing I really wanted to address is just how bad of a matchup this is for the Chicago Bulls versus the Bucks. It's probably the worst one for them, honestly. As you kind of alluded to, I believe the Bucks have one win versus the top four seeds in each conference. And the reason for that, I think specifically in the East, who they usually play 3 to 4 times a year, is simply because of Nikola Vucevic. Nikola Vucevic is not a good rim protector. And in the East, that means you're facing Giannis, you're facing Joel Embiid, you're facing Bam Adebayo. Those are the top 3 seeds right now. And that is not a good run for Nikola Vucevic, who's not a good rim defender and not even a good defender whatsoever. So I think whenever the Bucks just go onto the floor, they just have the bigger men and the men who can get to the basket. And the Chicago Bulls like to play a lot of mid-range offense. That's DeMar DeRozan's shot. That's a great shot. It works a lot for him. But the problem with that is that he doesn't really generate a lot of rim pressure, nor does he shoot a lot of three-pointers to make up for their lack of defense. He's scoring 2, and it's just not as efficient as Giannis dunking the ball. And so if Nikola Vucevic can't defend the hoop, can't rim protect, then what is really the point of what DeMar DeRozan's doing? He can score 40, 45. I think during the last Bucks game, he actually scored 40 points, but it just wasn't enough. And I think injuries also have really plagued the Chicago Bulls. They're good perimeter defenders. Patrick Williams, Lonzo Ball, and Alex Caruso have all suffered injuries during the year. Lonzo Ball won't even be in this game. And they don't really have anybody to guard Giannis. So I think this is really just, I honestly would like to pick a sweep, but I think it's probably going to be 4-1. I really don't think there's much to talk about here. The Bulls are a team on the decline. The Milwaukee Bucks are a team that's looking to win the championship, and they are getting the perfect matchup for them where they have a big guy who the other team just can't guard.
Yeah, I think it's worth considering for Bulls fans. What offensive options are you going to rely on except for DeRozan and Levine? Keep in mind that the Bucks have one of the best guard defenders in the league in Drew Holiday. The Bucks have also had their share of defensive struggles this season. They have the 14th best defensive rating in the league. They haven't been nearly as good on the defensive end as they were last season.
Yeah.
But I do think it's worth considering how some of these players, especially with the re-addition of Brook Lopez into the lineup, begin to ascend and reintegrate as they come into the playoffs. My prediction is that their defensive, cohesiveness is going to improve and look a lot like last year. Drew Holiday was crucial in that Phoenix series, got a crucial late game steal against Devin Booker to win the title. And I think we've seen Drew Holiday be really effective against DeMar DeRozan in their regular season meetings. He's really limited DeRozan's efficiency. DeRozan has scored like 29 points, 25 points, but he scored 29 points in 30 shots against Drew Holiday. And I think that combined with the fact that the Bulls' next offensive options are likely, Kobe White or something,
Yeah, or like Io
maybe
Yeah, he's not
Vucevic
good enough.
are going to make it very difficult for the Bulls to create enough firepower despite having one of the best scorers in the league this year. I do expect that because the Bucks haven't been as elite, there will be one game at least where DeRozan manages to maybe win the game down to the wire in the fourth quarter. But I do think that most of the games, the Bulls are just not going to have any answer for Giannis Antetokounmpo. They're not going to have any answer for Brook Lopez and the ability of his play style combined with Antetokounmpo to space the floor to create downhill situations where it's almost impossible to defend Giannis Antetokounmpo. And I think the Bucks will likely take this series in 5 games. I think we should just give one game just to give some respect to DeRozan and the fact that it's likely one of them is close.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's really all we need to say about that series. I think we both think this series could have a lot of blowouts. I think the Milwaukee Bucks could win a couple games by 20 or 30. I think that's very possible. But kind of moving on to the next game and the last game, I believe, of the Eastern Conference, the Boston Celtics versus the Brooklyn Nets. This is one of those interesting series I was definitely talking about. I think this series could be incredible. I think it also could be blowout. I would like to hear what you think, but the Celtics are favored by 4. What are your thoughts, Jeff?
Yeah, so I think there are a litany of different things to consider. This is probably the most interesting series in the playoffs. And I think that comes from the fact that Brooklyn has had a myriad of lineups this season. KD was out for a while. They were running with a James Harden-led offense. Obviously, now he's on the Sixers. Kyrie can only play in away games. Now he can play in all games. And that's not to mention the addition of Ben Simmons, who they say is going to potentially return in games 4, 5, and 6 if they get there. And I think the uncertainty associated with the Nets, combined with the fact that no one really wants to doubt KD's ability to flat out carry a game, creates an interesting scenario where it's really hard to predict because the Nets have not looked the same the entire season. The only really consistent factors are that KD is going to be KD. And I think that also given the absence of Rob Williams and given the fact that the Celtics, despite losing him, have still remained the number one team on offense, defense, and net rating to end the season, creates a very, very interesting series where we have to see how the Celtics defensive schemes work against Kevin Durant. How are they going to guard Kevin Durant when he calls for the post up on the left wing? Is Marcus Smart going to be able to execute at an extremely high level in terms of guard defense, in terms of preventing KD from getting to all of his spots? And I think all of these factors create a lot of uncertainty. And I think that's what makes this series so interesting, is that we don't know necessarily what we're going to get out of both teams.
Yeah, for sure. I agree with a lot of your points there. To kind of structure my argument, I guess, I'm going to kind of go into both of the injuries, then talk about the offense for each team, and then talk about the defense. So first with the injuries, Ben Simmons says he'll play games 4, 5, or 6. That's when he'll kind of expect him to return to the series. I don't expect him to return, honestly, till game 5 or 6. I think game 4 is a bit optimistic. There's a strong possibility in my mind that he doesn't return at all. I think it could be encouraging, but I think this could actually be a disadvantage if what the Celtics decide to do in that series is just as soon as he gets on the floor, foul him, make him go to the free throw line and prove that he can shoot free throws. Now, if he can shoot free throws, then we have a real player. We have a player that we actually need to account for. But until then, I'm not really willing to say what he'll commit to the team. I think he can guard, But if they just foul him and make him go to the free throw line and destroy the offense of the Nets, then they're going to have to take him out. So I don't really
Yeah,
see the kind of impact he's going to have there. I think the
I
next
think.
thing, yeah,
Sorry, I
continue.
just wanted to. I think Ben Simmons is an interesting point because despite the fact that everyone wants him to come in and play the last few games of the series, no one is really quite sure what role he's going to play within the Nets offense and defense. Is he going to play the five? Is he going to run pick and rolls with KD and Kyrie? Is he going to be more of a ball handler, more of a playmaker, really execute in the open court? No one's really sure. I think, people are pretty confident that Ben Simmons is going to be able to guard the 1 through 5. And I definitely believe that next season, Ben Simmons is going to be an elite defender, really strengthen the Nets perimeter defense. But I think after not playing for, I don't know, almost a year,
Yeah.
it's really hard for me to just say that Ben Simmons is just going to come into this series and make a difference if it even gets to game 5 and 6.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And kind of moving on to the second injury that's super important here is just the absence of Robert Williams and kind of the problems that creates for the Celtics and when he's going to come back. I think Robert Williams will also come back in this series. I think game 2, 3, 4 is kind of when I'd expect him. I think game 3 would be a perfect time because of that 2 to 3 day rest period that comes when moving locations, which for them is not very far because Boston and Brooklyn aren't so far apart. But I think his impact in this series can be key because people like Bruce Brown, for example, or Nicholas Claxton, they're players that don't really have any pressure from the 3-point line, which is where Robert Williams has really shown his value. He often plays a kind of lurker type defense. And to kind of explain what it is, he essentially guards someone who can't shoot and just stands in the paint and waits until somebody drives and then he blocks their shot. That's kind of his role. And so he basically punishes you for playing big people that can't shoot. And the Nets don't really have that great of players. And so he fits perfectly into that. They have maybe one or
Yeah.
two shooters out on the floor with Kyrie and KD, but whenever they don't have those one or two shooters, or they have their fifth man like Nicholas Claxton or Bruce Brown, for example, they're going to have somebody where Robert Williams III can guard, but stay in the paint and make sure to make it hard for Kyrie Irving.
Yeah, I think what Robert Williams enables is a lot more aggressive perimeter defense.
Yeah, for sure. A
His
lot of aggressive.
presence as a rim protector definitely changes the Celtics defense. And that's not to say that with Horford and Tice trying to play that role, they're not going to be able to create similar defensive situations. We've seen in a comparison that when Tice plays instead of Rob Williams, he's allowing about 6 more points at the rim per 100 possessions. But
It's
I
not
think we've
crazy.
seen
Yeah.
similar defensive schemes from the Celtics, obviously, with Rob out.
Yeah,
And
for
I think
sure.
especially if he comes back, his presence and his ability to enable also Marcus Smart is something that's going to give the Nets a lot of problems.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, Robert Williams III is a leaper, and I don't think Al Horford and Tice are. But
Right.
next, I kind of wanted to talk about both teams' offense, and then we'll get into both teams' defense next. So I think for offense for the Nets, it's clear they're going to get about 40. I think they'll get about 60 to 70 points a night on average with Kyrie Irving and KD. Where are they going to get the extra 30 to 40? This is not a low scoring series. I think the Nets don't really have a good defense. So where are they going to get the extra 30 to 40? I think we can look at 4 players. 4 players are going to have to impact the game in an incredible way. And I think these 4 players, 2 of them have to be on any given night. So first is Bruce Brown. I think he can have a huge impact as that short roll man. And a lot of people have been talking about him as a short roll man. And what does that mean? Essentially, it means he gets the ball around the free throw line when they double KD at the 3-point line. And he basically is playing a mini 4-on-3 because there's 2 people who are on KD that are now basically behind the play. And essentially, he's operating in a fast break type of position. A lot of times he has this great floater game that'll put the ball in. And I think that's going to be key for them. Bruce Brown has to activate that offense whenever KD or Kyrie get doubled. The second person I really target is Seth Curry. Seth Curry did not play good in their most recent playing game. I think he made only 1 3 and he took about 7 or 8 attempts. He needs to be on for them to win. A great 3-point shooter really spaces the floor for them. And it kind of exponentially improves the amount of space that they're going to have. And maybe they can't sit Robert Williams in the paint, which will make it a lot harder for the Celtics to defend Kyrie when he drives to the rim. The third player I'm looking at is Goran Dragic. He's been with the team just for a little bit of time, but I think he can really activate that second unit. One of the key problems with the Nets offense is the lineups without KD and without Kyrie. Even without either of them, they go down about 5 points each time one of them goes out. And when both of them go out, it's a disaster. So Goran Dragic can kind of make his own moves and try to play kind of one-on-one basketball and maybe help out the Nets when both of them are resting, because they've both been playing super heavy minutes. And to make it to the championship, I think they're really going to need somebody to kind of give them rest. And the last person I think that's key is Nicholas Claxton. I think if he can kind of be a great rim pressure person with Andre Drummond as well, I think they can both kind of do this role. They can make it so that they can have easy alley-oops and easy points that aren't as hard as the normal KD and Kyrie.
Yeah, I think Andre Drummond is something worth looking into. He's been a pretty interesting late season addition. He's had some pretty great offensive performances. He played really well against the Cavs in their play-in game, but he's not been that great on defense.
Yeah.
He plays drop a lot on pick and rolls with Tatum and Brown. And what that usually leads to is really easy shots for both of them. Jason Tatum is obviously a great shooter, or it leads to a lot of wide open dunks when someone stands in that dunker's spot.
Kind of
that is created whenever Drummond plays in the drop. And I think that looking into how his offense is able to mitigate any of those defensive weak points is going to be interesting with Drummond.
The only thing he does on defense, though, that is a plus is he is a rebounder. He really knows how to rebound the ball. So you're going to get the ball back at least when they miss a shot. So to kind of address the Celtics offense, I think the Celtics offense is a little bit more interesting. I think Jason Tatum will give about 30 throughout the series. I think Jaylen Brown with him will probably give about 50 to 55 points. So significantly less than Kyrie and KD, but they don't really need to give as much. I think the key to this series on offense for the Celtics will be Grant Williams and Peyton Pritchard. Those are their 2 3-point shooters. So in the middle of the year, the Celtics started to get on a tear. And one of the main reasons for getting on the tear, even before the trade deadline, was the fact that they were replacing bad 3-point shooters with good 3-point shooters. And Grant Williams and Peyton Pritchard are above 40% 3-point shooters, and they kind of improve the spacing on the floor and allow Jason Tatum to work one-on-one. I think those two combined will at least need to have one good game here and there. I think Al Horford also is key, as well as Marcus Smart, in facilitating the offense. I think that's where they fall into place, really. And by facilitating, allowing Marcus Smart to get some shots, allowing Jason Tatum to get some shots, allowing Jaylen Brown to get some shots, that's where the key part of it happens. But where I'm really going to be looking at in this first game to see, are the Celtics going to win it as quickly as I think they can win it, is how does their offense operate in the clutch? They're still ranked as one of the worst clutch offenses in the league of the playoff teams in the playoffs right now. And the reason for that has been in the past that Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum love to play iso ball, or Marcus Smart loves to shoot step up threes. And that's not how offense at the elite level operates unless you're Kevin Durant or Kyrie Irving. So I think it's key that we kind of see some semblance of passing the ball, finding great plays, finding wide open shooters, something like that, to where we can have faith in the Boston Celtics in clutch time, because playoff games are close. That's just how playoff games are. And I think the Boston Celtics really have no questions from minute 1 to minute 45. But those last 3 minutes, if Jason Tatum just says it's my ball and shoots every single shot, I think that's less encouraging for me. Even if they can win one game doing that, I'm not going to be as encouraged if they don't pass it to their shooters like Peyton Pritchard and Grant Williams, and they make a couple threes and we can have a whole team. I think that's what Ime Udoka, their coach, has really been promoting, to have a team atmosphere on offense and have everyone facilitate. And Marcus Smart has definitely been doing a better job of it lately. But I think, that's the main point. They need to kind of pass in the clutch.
Yeah, I think the last point that I think is really important for the Celtics is, how are you going to guard Kevin Durant?
Yeah.
I talked earlier about stopping KD calling for it in the post. There were a couple of possessions this year where Marcus Smart is able to deflect or steal on those passes where KD calls for it. And I think making it difficult for KD is going to be really important. It's pretty much impossible to stop KD from scoring in a lot of these situations. KD's offensive package and, the reason he's one of the greatest scorers in league history is because all of his offensive options, 80% of them are pretty much impossible to guard. You're just
Yeah,
praying that KD misses.
unguardable.
So I think that that's going to be really important. But it's important to remember that the Celtics rank first in the league in guarding isolation this year. Horford has guarded the most in isolation and gotten a lot of perimeter stops. And I think that's going to
Great
make it
isolation
somewhat
player.
difficult for the Celtics, especially when they have to go to other offensive options. Like you talked about them, Seth, Bruce Brown, Drummond, Cam Thomas, etc. And I think that in combination with the Nets, who are relatively small compared to,
The
the
large
Nets run a
Celtics.
relatively small lineup. I think we could see some difficulties from them on both ends of the floor, especially the defensive end. And I think to give my prediction, I definitely think that having Kyrie and Kevin Durant allows you to win, at least 2 games. But I do think that given the fact that the Celtics are lacking Rob Williams for some of them, I would almost pencil it in to be a 7-game series. But I do think you have to look at late season performances. The Celtics being the number one team in the league by far in the second half of the season, combined with historical efficiency on the defensive end, makes it so that the Celtics are going to take this series in 7 games.
Yeah, so I think to kind of address your defense point, I think it's clear that the Celtics have a great defense. They can keep a lead. I think the biggest question for the Nets is, can they keep a lead with their defense? They haven't shown the ability to do that. In the Cleveland Cavs game, they were up by 20 and the Cleveland Cavaliers came back as soon as Kevin Durant left the floor. And a lot of people have been saying the Nets can turn on, quote unquote, the defense. I don't think they can. I really don't think that defense is there. They don't really have the personnel for it. And I think the Celtics are really elite defensively. So for the series, I'm really tempted to pick the Boston Celtics. I think they could actually win in 5 or 6. But my big caveat is, if this gets to a game 7, I don't think the Celtics can win, because if the Celtics are in a game 7, that likely means that Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown had some of those games, I think, where in the clutch, they were the ones taking the shots and they weren't passing the ball around. And I think in a game 7, that's when that really hurts you, because you only have one option in the clutch, whereas they have 2 great options. And KD is a great assister. He's become a better passer over the year. So I think their offense will look better in the clutch, and then that will lead to the Nets winning. But my pick would be the Celtics in 6 if I had to put it down on the paper right now.
Okay, well, it looks like we got a pretty good Eastern Conference. I'm really excited for that to start today. And I hope that all of these series get close. Um, I think it would be really awesome if I think there is potential for there to be 2 game 7s in the
For sure.
first
Yeah. The
round.
East,
Um,
especially. Yeah.
and I also think it's possible that there's 2 sweeps. So
Yeah.
we'll
That's true
see.
too.
But
What's your favorite one? Which one are you going to be keying into?
yeah, I think the one I'm definitely gonna. I'm gonna watch all of them, but the one that I'm gonna look the most into is the Celtics Nets series. They've had a lot of great close games this year. Jason Tatum has leveled up. He's, top 5 MVP candidate. Um, and I think together, yeah, I would definitely watch that one.
Okay. Yeah. I'm definitely going to be watching the Celtics Nets. I think that's my favorite one by
Yeah.
far. But all right,
Okay.
guys.
Well,
So that ends
I think
kind of
we're
our.
gonna.
Huh?
Sorry, no. I think we're gonna take a break and then we'll get to the Western Conference
Yep,
playoffs.
that's right. I was just going to say that, that's the end of our Eastern Conference play-in preview, but kind of keep on tuning in, and we'll get to the Western Conference next. Thank you, guys.
Okay, I gotta blow my nose. Be right back.
All good. All right. You ready?
Hello.
Hello. I can hear you. All right. Welcome to the Clear Path podcast. Now we're just going to be going into the Western Conference playoffs as kind of a break from our Eastern Conference playoffs. We're not really going to go into the Warrior series as much. You can check out our earlier podcast for that. But first off, I wanted to start off with maybe the most affected series by injury, the Dallas Mavericks versus the Utah Jazz. I wanted to get your thoughts on that, Jeff.
Yeah. So obviously Luca has been amazing this year. Top 5 MVP candidate yet again. And I think that if Luca was playing, I would pick the Dallas Mavericks on sheer firepower alone. That in combination with the end of season decline for the Utah Jazz really seems like it would affect their momentum coming into the playoffs. But with Luca's injury and, everyone being unsure of when he's going to return, he's already been ruled out for game 1. And, it's not, there's no indication that it's going to look any better for game 2. I think we're going to see a pretty difficult series, or at least first 2 games from the Dallas Mavericks on the offensive end.
Yeah,
Dallas's defense has really improved and been elite in the second half of the season. They've had one of the best defenses in the league, but I do think that lacking Luca, his usage rate is unparalleled in the NBA, along with like Trae Young. And I think having that offensive option just out is going to force such a seismic change in the Mavericks that I'm not sure they're going to be able to get it done. Even against a struggling Utah team, Utah's personnel still looks the same almost as it did last year. And I think given that Luka's not going to be playing, we're going to see a lot of players step up. And I do believe that unless Luka returns in game 2 or even game 3, and unless he looks near the same as he has in years past, I would bet that the Mavericks are going to have a really hard time against Utah.
Yeah. So I think the way I'd like to break it down first is I'm going to talk about like the injuries once again, then offense and defense for both teams. So I think the injury that's key in this series, as you kind of alluded to, is Luka Doncic. For me, it's just kind of interesting actually, though, because I'm curious what happens with the heliocentric offense when the primary star gets injured. How does it look? I'm really curious to see. Can they win even a game? I kind of doubt it. I think the fact that Luka's usage rate is so high kind of shows that there's probably a reason. There's probably not another player that can equal his stature. Spencer Dinwiddie and Jalen Brunson have been better lately, but I just don't think it's enough to overcome the Utah Jazz. And I think the Utah Jazz smell blood in the water. So I think they'll really go after it and try and win game 1 and game 2, because I don't expect Luka Doncic to come back before game 3 or game 4. Now, to kind of go into the offense of both teams, I don't really know how the Mavericks offense is going to look, honestly. If they put Jalen Brunson in the Luka Doncic role, we can expect a lot of screen and rolls. We can expect a lot of screens into passes to open 3-point shooters and a lot of floor spacing. But I don't know if they can really do that because we haven't seen Jalen Brunson operate at that level yet, at the Luka Doncic level. We've seen him operate at a high level, but not that level. So I think
he really struggled in the playoffs last year. Brunson did not play amazingly. And I just think trying to approximate Luka with 2 guys even is going to be a difficult task, despite Dinwiddie ending the season pretty well.
Yeah, and I think it's just going to be tough overall. Maybe Jason Kidd will opt for a more defensive lineup because of that and just try to be good on defense. But I think the Jazz really are going to have the upper hand in terms of offense. And the way they run their offense is really, I feel like, advantageous just because they have a lot of shooters. They have Rudy Gobert in the paint, and that's pretty much it. They shoot the ball, and they're going to shoot threes, and they're going to force you to try and outscore them. And if Luka Doncic isn't there, the Mavericks offense just might not be able to produce that amount of pointage and might not be able to actually score those baskets as easily as they used to. And that will lead to their offensive rating decreasing. And I think that will lead to the Jazz just outshooting them. And then for the defensive end for both sides, I feel like the question is, can the Jazz have really poor defenders on the perimeter? They really rely on Rudy Gobert. When you look at his on-off numbers, when Rudy Gobert is off the floor, their defense tanks. And even though their defense hasn't been elite this year, it's been elite in the past, and it's still good with Rudy Gobert out there, but it's really, really bad, almost the worst in the league, I believe, with him out of the lineup. So I think it's key that Rudy Gobert continues to be that paint presence and that they continue to try and play perimeter defense, because I just think
Yeah.
this game is going to be who outscores who. And for the Mavericks, they've had a great defense, but without Luka, I'm just not sure how it's going to look. I
Yeah.
really can't predict it.
I think, when your second best, or, when your best basically perimeter defender is Mike Conley, and
Yeah.
you have to face an offense against Luka Doncic, who's been one of the most dynamic, amazing scorers in the past few years, you have a situation where Luka is going to be able to create a lot of chaos, and just get to his spots. But given that he's gone now, the Mavericks are going to have a lot more difficult time exploiting that weak spot in the Utah defense.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. They're going to have a lot of difficulty doing that. And that's why for my pick here, I'm going to be going with the Utah Jazz in 6. I think the Dallas Mavericks will not have Luka Doncic for maybe 2 or 3 games. I think after that, he's going to be hampered. And I think the Utah Jazz will then win in 6. Currently, for the game 1, the Utah Jazz are favored by 5.5 points. It's continued to go up over the day. It started at about 4. Now it's at 5.5. I expect it to go somewhere between 6 and 7, just because the Dallas Mavericks are not used to playing without Luka Doncic. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think barring Luka making a miracle return in game 2, I think that Donovan Mitchell has been sensational in past playoffs.
For
Despite their
sure.
losses, he's been pretty good. And I think that with the one of the most heliocentric offenses in the NBA, losing the star, I think that's just too much for the Mavericks to overcome. I love Jalen Brunson. I love what Dinwiddie's been able to do. They had that game winner over the Warriors. And I've really been a big fan of Maxi Kleber's contributions on the defensive end, along with Dwight Powell. But I don't think that this is a lineup missing Luka that can defeat the Utah Jazz. And I think the Jazz are probably going to take it in 5 games if Luka's not playing.
Okay, well, that's definitely good to know. So I would cover the Golden State Warriors versus the Denver Nuggets next, but you guys got to check out our other podcast kind of featuring them, as we go really in depth onto why we think Golden State or Denver will win. Obviously, we're a Golden State podcast, so we pick Golden State too. But you can check us out there. But the next series I wanted to go into, maybe one of the more interesting of the Western Conference. I think we can both agree that this conference is not nearly as interesting as the East, though, is the Memphis Grizzlies versus the Minnesota Timberwolves, the play-in contender, championship winner looking Minnesota Timberwolves. Currently, I believe the Memphis Grizzlies are favored to win this series, as well as favored to win this first game by about 6.5 points. I want to know your thoughts on this series, Jeff.
Yeah, I think this has the potential to be a lot closer than people think.
I agree.
I remember watching the NBA on TNT guys after the Timberwolves game, and I think Chuck and Shaq actually predicted the Timberwolves to win. Now, I don't know if I would take the Timberwolves over the second best team in the league this season in terms of record, but I do think that one of the most interesting things in this series is Minnesota's defense. In a few of their regular season meetings this year, Patrick Beverley made it really difficult, and also Anthony Edwards in a few possessions, for Ja Morant to get the ball and execute the offense like he likes to in most of the regular season games. And I think that just making it difficult for Ja Morant to get these touches and get these, high flying
easy
rim
baskets,
attempts that he likes to go for is going to make it a lot harder for Ja Morant to get into a rhythm than he might be able to get into against other less defensively annoying teams.
Hmm.
I also think that, we talked about in the Plan podcast how Jared Vanderbilt has been a great perimeter defender this year. And I think we're
Hmm.
going to see that come in handy against players like Desmond Bain, who have shown out this year and shown they can execute from the 3-point line. And I also think that D'Angelo Russell's shift into this kind of new defensive quarterback where he's able to close passing lanes, help effectively, kind of like Draymond, is going to create a very tight, cohesive, sometimes kind of crazy and chaotic Minnesota defense that is going to make this series really difficult on the Grizzlies.
Yeah. So I think first off, the first thing I'm happy for is there's not really any injuries to talk about finally. There's no star player that's injured. John Morant is coming off an injury, which is of some concern. I think he might be a little slow in the series to start it, but nobody's injured currently, and I'm hoping it stays that way. Now, for the offense for both teams, diving into the Memphis Grizzlies offense, I think they really just have to see how good are their role players in the playoffs. Generally, role players underperform in the playoffs compared to the regular season, and generally young players underperform in the playoffs. I mean, in the playoffs, regular to the regular season. So we have to see what's that transition going to be like going into the playoffs. And I think that is really key for us to look at here in this case, just because none of their young players that they really need are necessarily stars yet, besides John Morant and Desmond Bain. We have to look at how will Tyus Jones perform? How will Zaire Williams perform? And those players who they're relying on to shoot threes. This is going to be a high flying game. Both teams love to push the pace. The Memphis Grizzlies love to go back and forth. And so I think both teams will be ready for that. Memphis knows that Minnesota will be ready for that. And I think that's where Steven Adams, players like that, veterans are key to the Memphis Grizzlies in terms of settling them and making sure that when they're going on a run, they keep steady. And when they're losing on a run, they keep steady as well. And I think can the Memphis Grizzlies generate great rim pressure with Ja Morant and Jaren Jackson Jr. is really going to be key on their offense. For the Minnesota Timberwolves offense, I think what's going to be key here is Karl Anthony Towns going to look like a bull in the china shop? And what I mean by that is last game, he fouled out with 8 minutes left. He kind of just ran over people and then fouled. And then he'd try to run over the back of people and get rebounds. They need him to be elite. They need him to be a significantly better player than Jaren Jackson Jr. They need to have the best two players on the floor, I think, to win this game just because of the mismatch in terms of role players. Because obviously Memphis's role players have gone like 20-3 without Ja Morant, showing just how elite their role players are. But if Cat and D'Lo and Anthony Edwards together can be better than, Ja Morant and Jaren Jackson Jr. and Dylan Brooks, I think that's where the Minnesota Timberwolves really stand a chance to win on the offensive end.
Yeah, I think, the Minnesota offense has been somewhat unstable for parts of the season. But one thing to keep in mind is that the offense, especially D'Angelo Russell, have been great in clutch situations. And I think what we saw happen in that Clippers game is that Minnesota actually has a few great offensive options to go to. We saw Cat wasn't even playing, and that D'Lo and Ant were able to generate enough offense in order to overpower the Clippers. And I do think that this series, that's going to be really important. But I think for me, the key factor is how are the Timberwolves going to disrupt any of the offensive flow that the Grizzlies have been able to find so consistently during the season with or without Ja Morant?
Yeah.
Ja Morant has obviously been explosive this year. He's been a great player, top candidate, maybe not MVP candidate with the missed games, but he's been in that echelon of players.
Yeah,
and
for sure.
Despite that, Ja Morant does not have amazing efficiency. And I also think that D'Angelo Russell's ability and Jared Vanderbilt's ability to guard the perimeter, close passing lanes, make it difficult for Ja Morant to catch passes in stride and go for those crazy rim attempts. I think if the Timberwolves can do that, execute at that high level, I think the defense for them is key. I really think they can win maybe 2 games, maybe even 3 games this series.
Yeah, for sure. I think for the defense for both teams, I think this is not going to be a defensive battle at all. I think the key is, can the Minnesota Timberwolves limit Jaren Jackson Jr.'s blocking ability? He led the league in blocks, I believe, this year. He also fouls a lot, though. That's something to keep in mind as you watch during the series. But making sure to limit his blocking ability and limit the fact that he can kind of close off the rim and put the kind of lid on the bucket for the Minnesota Timberwolves. And so I think that's going to be key in terms of the Memphis Grizzlies side of defense. I think for the Timberwolves, it's, is Cat exposed, and can they have a guard that can stay in front of Ja Morant? Because Ja Morant is a fast twitch guy. He moves very swiftly. He can really, he's a leaper. Do they have, can Jared Vanderbilt, can D'Lo kind of just stay in front of him? They don't have to mitigate him entirely. Just make sure that he sees the body at all times. I think that's going to be key on the defensive end. But
Yeah.
kind of to that end, I'm going to be picking the Memphis Grizzlies in 7. I think this series is going to be great. I think there's going to be a lot of trash talking. Everyone's going to be getting up and down the floor. They're both young teams. And I think it's going to be a lot of great series and a lot of great clutch moments. What about you?
Yeah. I think it's going to come down to Minnesota's defense and how John Morant looks. I think the Grizzlies love to create rim pressure. They love to attack. And especially with Minnesota's defensive scheme changing a little, Cat playing in some drop, I wonder how that rim protection is going to look. I do think
Yeah.
they'll be great from the perimeter. And I think if D'Lo especially can really evolve on the defensive end more than he already has this year,
Yeah, that will
I
definitely help.
think the Timberwolves are going to create a lot of problems for the Grizzlies.
For sure.
Unfortunately, I'm not really sold on Karl Anthony Towns as an amazing playoff offensive option.
Yeah. Okay.
He's only played in the playoffs once, I believe, and that
Yeah,
was with Jimmy Butler.
that's true.
So I think, given the uncertainty that comes with the Timberwolves, although I really believe in their Patrick Beverly, D'Lo, Vanderbilt defensive schemes, I think I'm going to take the Grizzlies in 6 games just because I think they've been too great this season, and I don't think that they're going to buckle under the pressure, at least against the Timberwolves.
All right. So I think we kind of agree on that one, but just the games are a bit different. So the last series we have are the Phoenix Suns versus the New Orleans Pelicans. Currently, the New Orleans Pelicans are underdogs by 10 points, meaning the Phoenix Suns are favored by 10 points. And I think this is probably going to be one of the more boring series. And the Phoenix Suns have been one of the best teams all season. The New Orleans Pelicans have been one of the worst teams all season in terms of who made the playoffs. Jeff, I want to know your thoughts. Who's winning it? What do you see happening in this series?
Yeah, I mean, it pains me to say this as a Warriors fan, but the Suns have just been an amazingly clutch, deep team this year. They've been amazing on both ends of the floor. Mikal Bridges has blossomed into a DPOY candidate. Chris Paul and Devin Booker have looked phenomenal on the offensive end. And that's not to mention both of their clutch numbers. I'm not sure that's going to necessarily be a winning point for them, especially in close playoff games against the Warriors or the Bucks, for example.
Yeah.
But I do think when they play teams like the Pelicans, you have to give Phoenix credit. They're a 64-win team. They have been, gunning on all cylinders for almost the entire year, even with CP3's injury. And, I really do like the Pelicans. They had a phenomenal game last night. They let the Clippers back in a little, but they really began to execute in the last few minutes of the game. I think Herb Jones's perimeter defense, along with a decent scoring punch from CJ and BI, are going to make it maybe a fun series for 1 or 2 games, but I really don't see New Orleans winning any more than 1 game max, just because Phoenix has been too great this season. In the last 15 games, they've been number 3 in terms of net rating. And I think that, just given who they've shown they are the whole year, the Pelicans are not that team that's going to be able to give them a fight.
Yeah. So I think this is probably the one that we probably need to break down the least, just because the Phoenix Suns have been dominant all year. both teams don't really have any injury. Brandon Ingram's coming off injury, but he's looked great recently. In the last game, I think he put up over 30 points. And I'm glad that nobody's injured in this series, really. Kind of moving on to the offense for both of these teams. I think the Phoenix Suns just have a dominant offense. They're great in the clutch. They have kind of the old traditional type of offense. They have a big who's dominant. They have a point guard who's short and can pass the ball. And they have Devin Booker, who's kind of the shooting guard who shoots a lot, can make those mid-range shots that you need in the clutch. And they have great role players like Mikal Bridges. They have a great backup center, JaVale McGee and Bismack Biyombo, and they have great role players that just fit nicely with what they're trying to do. And Chris Paul is able to kind of facilitate it all. They're really a team with seemingly no holes. It seems like they really just can't lose games, and that's why they're one of the most dominant teams in the league. And I think looking at the past, I don't think a team with over 63 wins, which I believe the Suns have over 63 wins in the regular seasons, has ever lost in the first round. Most of the time, they make it at least to the Western Conference Finals or the finals. And so I think this is not where they're going to be out. I think maybe we can look in future rounds. Maybe they'll face a tougher challenge. But personally, I think that New Orleans offense, it's great with Brandon Ingram and CJ McCollum. It's definitely much better than it was earlier in the year, but I really just don't think they can score on the Phoenix Suns defense, who really have lockdown defenders. And Chris Paul's been a lot better defensively lately. And Devin Booker's really been putting more in on the defensive end as well. And DeAndre Ayton has been a great defensive player this year. He's been able to kind of rim protect for that team and make it so that if anybody makes mistakes, he can cover for it. And I really want to shout out Mikal Bridges here. He's in the running for defensive player of the year, and he's a great perimeter defender to kind of shut down CJ McCollum or Brandon Ingram. I think they'll likely put him on CJ McCollum this game just because of the size matchup. And I think that he'll shut him down and make it so that he's inefficiently scoring, which is what the Phoenix Suns need. And I think this is going to be an easy series from my vantage point. I think it's probably going to be a sweep or a 4-1 series in favor of the Phoenix Suns. I think the New Orleans Pelicans are a team that's happy to be in the playoffs, and they don't really see themselves winning a championship.
Yeah, I think this is going to be a sweep. And I think the question for Phoenix comes not necessarily later in the playoffs, but during the length of the playoffs. What we're looking for is, how is Chris Paul going to hold up throughout this entire stretch, more so than are they going to be able to win some of these early round matchups. So I think, the Pelicans have a great story this year. I just don't think they're going to be able to. And, they've been one of the best teams in the league, obviously relative to their strength of schedule, in the last half of the season, but I really don't see them presenting much of a challenge to Phoenix. I think it's a sweep, and I think the thing to be looking for, especially if you're a Warriors fan, is how does Chris Paul hold up within these first two rounds?
Yeah, for sure. I think that's the most important question. How do they get out of this round? How do they win this round? Not if they're going to win this round. Yeah. So, all right. I think that finishes our episode on the Western Conference side. I think we just covered the Eastern Conference kind of earlier. And so check that out if you want to kind of know more about the Eastern Conference. But thank you guys for listening. I think we have a lot of series here. I hope you guys have some time to watch some of them. Which is your most interesting playoff matchup in the Western Conference, Jeff, besides the Warriors and the Nuggets? That's obviously the most interesting. But
yeah, I think the most interesting one for me is Grizzlies Timberwolves.
Yeah,
I'm just really fascinated by the Timberwolves defense, and I think they provide for a lot of really entertaining watching, especially when we see players like Anthony Edwards, who has questionable efficiency, but has that great first step, has that explosiveness that, kind of rivals John Morant. And I think that matchup is going to be really fun to watch.
Yeah, I'm just excited to watch some playoff basketball finally, get hyped, and see the ball moving quickly, see that those defenders locking in. We kind of already saw it last night with Nicholas Batum. He looked like a boss. So I can't wait to see everything happen. And thank you guys for listening. I appreciate you guys listening. And if you have any topics you want us to cover, please message us on our social media, and we'll see you all in the next episode. Thank you.